My father put me out of the house with the words, "You're not my son. Get out before I call the police." A month later I came back, and now his business belongs to me. Look, I never thought I'd be telling this story on Reddit, but here we are. Some of you guys might think this sounds like some made-up revenge fantasy, but I swear on my grandmother's apple pie recipe, this really happened to me. I was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree that my dad constantly reminded me was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I lived at home because, let's be real, who can afford rent these days on an entry-level salary? My plan was simple. Save up some money, maybe work for the family business eventually, and figure out my life like every other millennial stumbling through their 20s. The thing about my dad is that he was always secretive about the business. Not in a shady way, mind you, just in that old-school way where he figured kids didn't need to know about adult matters. Whenever I asked about work, he'd grunt something about contracts and suppliers and change the subject to whether I'd mowed the lawn yet. My younger brother Jake was the same way. They had this little boys club thing going where I was perpetually on the outside looking in. But here's where things get interesting. I was working on this project for my business ethics class. Yeah, I know. The irony isn't lost on me now, and I needed to analyze the corporate structure of a real company. Professor Morrison wanted us to dig into SEC filings, annual reports, that kind of dry stuff that makes your eyes glaze over faster than watching paint dry. Since I was living at home and had access to Dad's home office, I figured I'd just use his company as my case study. Made sense, right? Save myself some research time and maybe learn something about the family business in the process. Dad was out of town that weekend at some supplier conference, so I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to gather some basic information without bothering him. I fired up a computer. Password was still Bears 1985, because some things never change, and started browsing to the company files. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Invoices, employee records, supplier contracts. Pretty standard small business stuff that would work perfectly for my assignment. Then I decided to check the SEC website directly to pull the official corporate registration documents. You know, just to make sure I had all the legal details right for my paper. I typed in the company name, found the filing, and started scrolling through the usual boring corporate paperwork. That's when I saw it, right there in black and white, in the section listing beneficial owners and trustees. My name, not my dad's name, not my brother's name, mine. And not just my name, my full legal name, my social security number, and our home address listed as the primary beneficiary of something called a revocable family trust. Now, I'm no legal expert, but I'd taken enough business law classes to know that being listed as a beneficiary on a trust isn't exactly small potatoes. This wasn't some clerical error or typo. Someone had specifically put my information into official SEC documents, which means lawyers were involved, papers were signed, and this was serious business. My first thought was that maybe this was some kind of college fund setup that Grandpa had arranged before he passed. You know how grandparents sometimes set up education trusts without telling anyone? But as I kept reading, it became clear this wasn't about tuition money. This trust apparently held controlling interest in the entire company. I printed out the documents, my hand shaking a little, because I was starting to realize this was way bigger than I'd thought. The more I read, the more confused I got. The trust had been established in 2009, a year before Grandpa died. The language was all legal mumbo-jumbo, but the basic gist seemed to be that someone, presumably my grandfather, had set up this arrangement where I would eventually inherit control of the business. When Dad got home Sunday night, I was waiting for him in the kitchen with the printout spread out on the table like some kind of intervention setup. He walked in, saw the papers, and his face went from tired to stone-cold serious in about 2 seconds flat. I tried to keep it casual, you know? I held up the SEC filing and asked him what this address thing was all about. Told him I had found my name in the company documents while working on a school project and was wondering if he knew anything about it. The reaction was not what I expected. Dad didn't look surprised or confused. He looked angry. Not just regular angry, but that kind of quiet, dangerous angry that makes you want to back away slowly. He glanced at the papers for maybe half a second. then looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. He told me not to mess around with things I didn't understand. Said it was probably just some paperwork mistake, and I should forget about it. When I tried to explain that SEC documents aren't exactly known for random clerical errors, he cut me off and told me to drop it. The whole conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but the tension in that kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Dad's reaction didn't sit right with me. If this really was just a paperwork mistake, why hadn't he seemed surprised? Why hadn't he offered to call his lawyer or accountant to get it sorted out? Instead, he'd acted like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. So naturally, being a curious 22-year-old with too much time on my hands, I decided to dig a little deeper. And that's when this whole mess really started to unravel. So let me start from the beginning. My dad wasn't exactly what you'd call the warm and fuzzy type. Picture your typical Midwest business owner. Flannel shirts, steel-toed boots, and the kind of handshake that could crush walnuts. He ran this mid-sized construction supply company that my grandfather started back in the 70s. Dad took it over when Grandpa passed in 2010, and honestly, I never really paid much attention to the business side of things. So naturally, being a curious 22-year-old with too much time on my hands, I decided to dig a little deeper. And that's when this whole mess really started to unravel. The next few weeks were weird, and I mean really weird. Dad started acting like I had some kind of contagious disease. He'd leave the room when I walked in, cut conversations short, and generally treated me like I was radioactive. My younger brother Jake noticed it too, but when I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said Dad was probably stressed about some big contract negotiations. But I knew it wasn't about contracts. Every time I walked past Dad's home office, I could hear him on hushed phone calls that would suddenly stop the moment he saw me. Once, I caught him quickly closing his laptop when I came into the kitchen for a midnight snack. The whole atmosphere in the house felt like walking on eggshells, except I was the only one who seemed to notice. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about those SEC documents. I kept going back to them, reading them over and over, trying to make sense of the legal language. I even spent a few late nights Googling terms like revocable trust and beneficial ownership, until my eyes burned from staring at the computer screen. Here's what I figured out. If these documents were legit, then technically I was supposed to have some kind of claim to the family business. Not immediately, mind you. The trust had all sorts of conditions and triggers. But eventually, the more I learned about how these things work, the more I realized that someone, probably my grandfather, had set this up very deliberately. I tried bringing it up with Dad one more time, maybe 2 weeks after that first kitchen confrontation. I waited until he seemed relaxed, watching his Sunday football game with a beer in hand. I figured if I approached it right, maybe he'd be willing to explain what was going on. Big mistake. Huge mistake. The moment I mentioned wanting to understand the trust documents better, he exploded like a pressure cooker that had been building steam for weeks. He started yelling about how I needed to stop digging around in things that didn't concern me, how I was being disrespectful, and how I should focus on finding a real job instead of playing detective. But here's the part that really got to me. He said I was getting too big for my britches and needed to remember my place in this family. My place, like I was some kind of subordinate employee instead of his son. That's when I knew this wasn't just about business documents or family secrets. This was personal. Things escalated pretty quickly after that. Dad started finding fault with everything I did. The way I loaded the dishwasher was wrong. I was taking too long in the shower. I wasn't contributing enough to household expenses. Suddenly, everything about my existence seemed to irritate him beyond belief. Jake tried to play peacekeeper for a while, suggesting that maybe I should just apologize and drop the whole thing. But I couldn't do it. Call it stubbornness or call it principle, but something deep down told me that this was bigger than just keeping the peace. My grandfather had put my name on those documents for a reason, and I deserved to know what that reason was. The tension in our house became unbearable. Dad would get up extra early for work just to avoid having breakfast at the same time as me. If I was watching TV in the living room, he'd find somewhere else to be. Family dinners became these awkward, silent affairs where everyone pretended everything was normal while you could practically feel the hostility radiating across the table. I started spending more time away from the house, hanging out at the library or grabbing coffee with college friends, just to avoid the toxic atmosphere. But even when I wasn't there, I could tell the situation was affecting the whole family dynamic. Jake was caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both of us, and even Mom seemed stressed about the constant tension. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. I'd been thinking about those trust documents all day, and I remember that Dad kept some of Grandpa's old business files and boxes in the garage. I figured maybe there were more clues in their original documents, correspondence, something that might explain what Grandpa had been thinking when he set up this trust. So after dinner, I went out to the garage and started looking through the boxes. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: old invoices, supplier catalogs from the 80s, faded photographs of construction projects. But in one of the dusty cardboard boxes, I found a manila folder labeled Estate Planning 2009. Jackpot! Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen before, including what looked like correspondence between my grandfather and his lawyer about setting up the trust. I was just starting to read through them when I heard footsteps behind me. Dad was standing in the garage doorway, and the look on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen. Not just angry, furious. His hands were clenched into fists, and for a moment I actually thought he might take a swing at me. Instead, he started yelling louder than I'd ever heard him yell before. He screamed about how I was snooping around like some kind of thief, how I had no right to go through Grandpa's personal papers, and how I was disrespecting the memory of a good man by digging up old business that should stay buried. The neighbors probably heard every word. Dad's voice was echoing off the garage walls like he was using a megaphone. When I tried to explain that I just wanted to understand what Grandpa had intended, Dad cut me off with something I'll never forget. He looked me straight in the eye and told me that I was nothing but an accidental mistake, that Grandpa had been getting senile toward the end and didn't know what he was doing, and that I'd never amount to anything more than a disappointment. An accidental mistake. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I mean, I'd always suspected I wasn't exactly planned. There's a pretty big age gap between me and Jake, but hearing it said out loud like that, with such venom, was devastating. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, like he'd been holding back these feelings for years and was finally letting them all out. Then came the ultimatum. Dad told me I had exactly 1 hour to pack my stuff and get out his house. Said if I wasn't gone by the time he came back from his evening walk, he'd call the police and have me removed for trespassing. He didn't care where I went or what I did, but I was no longer welcome under his roof. I stood there in that garage, holding those dusty papers, watching my father walk away from me like I was some stranger who'd wandered onto his property. 22 years of living in that house, and suddenly I was persona non grata because I'd asked too many questions about some legal documents. Jake came out to help me pack, and I could tell he felt bad about the whole situation. He kept saying things like, "You know how Dad gets," and "maybe this will all blow over in a few weeks." But even he seemed shocked by how nuclear Dad had gone. As he carried my suitcase out to my beat-up Honda Civic, he slipped me $200 and told me to call him if I needed anything. The crazy thing is, as I was throwing my clothes into garbage bags, I kept thinking about those estate planning documents I'd found. In all the chaos and yelling, I'd managed to stuff that manila folder into my backpack, along with my laptop and phone charger. Call it instinct or call it spite, but something told me those papers were important enough to hang on to. So there I was, 22 years old, officially homeless, with nowhere to go except my grandmother's house 3 towns over. Grandma had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over arguments and made sure everyone showed up for Christmas dinner. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it would be her. The drive to Grandma's house was probably the longest 45 minutes of my life. I kept replaying the garage confrontation in my head, wondering if I could have handled things differently. Maybe if I'd approached Dad more diplomatically, or waited for a better time to bring up the trust documents, things wouldn't have spiraled so completely out of control. But then I'd remember the look in his eyes when he called me an accidental mistake, and I get angry all over again. There's a difference between being disappointed in your kid and completely disowning them over some old paperwork. Even if I had been out of line, even if I had been too pushy about the whole thing, What kind of father kicks their son out of the house over a family business dispute? Grandma was waiting on her front porch when I pulled into her driveway, like she'd somehow sensed I was coming. Turns out Jake had called ahead to give her the basic rundown of what had happened. She took one look at me dragging my garbage bags up her front steps and just shook her head with that expression she got when she was disappointed in one of her children. She made me a cup of coffee, set out a plate of those store-bought cookies she always kept around, and let me tell her the whole story from beginning to end. Grandma was a good listener. She didn't interrupt or try to minimize what had happened. She just nodded and made little sympathetic sounds while I explained about finding my name in the SEC documents and Dad's increasingly hostile reaction to my questions. When I finished talking, Grandma was quiet for a long time. Finally, she looked at me with this sad smile and said something that made my blood run cold. She told me that my grandfather had been worried about exactly this scenario before he died. He'd suspected that Dad might not honor the trust arrangement and had specifically instructed her to keep certain documents safe in case they were ever needed. That's when she disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small fireproof safe that I'd seen sitting on her dresser for years but never really thought about. Inside were more legal documents, including what appeared to be the original trust agreement with my grandfather's signature, several letters addressed to me that were dated just months before he died, and a business card for a lawyer I'd never heard of. Sitting there in Grandma's kitchen, reading my grandfather's handwritten letters for the first time, I finally started to understand what had really been going on. This wasn't just about some random paperwork or a senile old man making questionable decisions. This was about my grandfather deliberately trying to protect the family business from my father's management style, and apparently, he'd chosen me as a successor for very specific reasons. The first letter was dated March 15th, 2009, about 8 months before Grandpa passed away. His handwriting was still strong and clear, definitely not the shaky scrawl of someone losing his mental faculties, like Dad had claimed. The letter started with, "My dear grandson," and went on to explain that he'd been watching the family dynamic for years and had some serious concerns about the future of the business. According to Grandpa, Dad had always been more interested in immediate profits than the long-term stability of the company. He'd been pushing to cut corners on quality, squeeze suppliers for unrealistic discounts, and generally run the business in a way that prioritized quick cash over sustainable growth. Grandpa wrote that he'd tried talking to Dad about these issues multiple times, but every conversation ended in arguments. But here's the part that really got me. Grandpa specifically mentioned that he'd been impressed by my questions about the business during family dinners. Apparently, those casual conversations where I'd asked about different construction projects or wondered about industry trends had made more of an impression than I'd realized. He wrote that I seemed to have a natural understanding of the relationship between customer satisfaction and long-term success. The second letter was even more detailed. Grandpa laid out his vision for how the trust should work, explaining that he wanted me to take over the business gradually, learning from experienced managers while Dad transitioned to a consulting role. He'd apparently discussed this plan with his lawyer extensively, making sure all the legal mechanisms were in place to ensure a smooth transition when the time was right. Reading these letters felt surreal, like discovering a secret family history that had been hidden right under my nose. Here was my grandfather, writing about me with respect and confidence, treating me like a capable adult who could handle serious responsibility. It was such a stark contrast to how Dad had been treating me that I actually got a little choked up sitting there at Grandma's kitchen table. The third letter was shorter but more urgent in tone. It was dated just 6 weeks before Grandpa died, and you could tell his health was declining by the way his handwriting had gotten a little shakier. But his message was crystal clear. He was worried that Dad would try to circumvent the trust arrangement, and he wanted to make sure I knew my rights and had access to competent legal representation if needed. That's where the business card came in. The lawyer's name was Margaret Chun, and according to Grandpa's letter, she specialized in estate planning and trust disputes. He'd apparently retained her services specifically to help me navigate any potential conflicts that might arise after his death. The retainer had been paid years in advance, so I wouldn't have to worry about legal fees if I decided to pursue the matter. Grandma watched me read through everything, occasionally refilling my coffee cup or passing me another tissue when I got emotional. When I finally looked up from the papers, she had this expression that was equal parts sad and determined. She told me that she'd been dreading this day for years, knowing that eventually the truth would come out and the family would probably tear itself apart. But she also said something that really stuck with me. She told me that my grandfather had been one of the most ethical businessmen she'd ever known, and that he'd built the company on principles of honesty, quality workmanship, and treating people fairly. If he'd felt strongly enough about preserving those values to set up this elaborate trust arrangement, then maybe I owed it to his memory to at least explore my options. I spent the next 3 days basically living in Grandma's basement, poring over legal documents and trying to understand exactly what my rights were under the trust agreement. The language was dense and full of legal jargon, but the basic structure was actually pretty straightforward. I was designated as the primary beneficiary, with control of the company transferring to me under certain conditions. Some of those conditions had already been met, like Grandpa being deceased for more than 2 years and me reaching the age of 21. Others were more subjective, like demonstrating readiness to assume business responsibilities and completing appropriate educational preparation. With my business degree, I seemed to meet most of the requirements, but there were still some gray areas that would probably need legal interpretation. The more I studied the documents, the more I realized that Dad had been walking a very fine line for the past several years. Technically, he was supposed to be managing the company as a trustee, with a fiduciary duty to preserve and grow the assets for my eventual benefit. But based on what I'd observed and what Grandpa had written in his letters, it seemed like Dad had been treating the business as his personal property instead. On Sunday morning, I finally worked up the courage to call Margaret Chen's office. I wasn't sure what to expect. After all, it had been years since Grandpa had set up this arrangement, and lawyers aren't exactly known for their long-term memory or sentimental attachment to old clients. For all I knew, she'd moved on to other things or wouldn't even remember the case. But when I explained who I was and mentioned my grandfather's name, her whole demeanor changed. She told me she'd been wondering when I'd eventually reach out, and that she'd actually been following the company's public filings over the years, keeping an eye on things from a distance. She suggested we meet in person as soon as possible to discuss the situation in detail. The drive to Margaret's law office felt like heading into battle. I'd never dealt with lawyers before, except for some basic legal advice I'd gotten in college, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Would she try to talk me out of pursuing this? Would she explain that the trust was somehow invalid or unenforceable? Part of me was almost hoping she'd tell me forget the whole thing and find a way to reconcile with Dad. Margaret's office was in one of those renovated historic buildings downtown, the kind with exposed brick walls and hardwood floors that screams established professional practice. She turned out to be probably in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of direct eye contact that makes you feel like she's reading your mind. After the usual pleasantries, she got straight to business. She pulled out a file folder that was easily 2 inches thick and started walking me through the legal framework that Grandpa had established. According to her analysis, the trust was rock solid from a legal standpoint. Grandpa had been very thorough in documenting his intentions, and all the necessary procedures had been followed to ensure the arrangement would hold up in court if challenged. But here's where things got interesting and a little scary. Margaret explained that if Dad had been mismanaging the trust assets or treating the company as his personal property, he could potentially be held liable for something called breach of fiduciary duty. In plain English, that meant he could be personally responsible for paying back any profits he'd taken that should have been preserved for my benefit. She pulled out a calculator and started running some rough numbers based on the company's public financial reports. Over the past few years, Dad had been taking out substantial distributions as the managing partner, paying himself a salary that was probably double what comparable business owners in the area were earning. If those payments were deemed inappropriate under the trust terms, we could potentially be talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. I sat there listening to Margaret break down the financial implications, feeling like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. This had started as curiosity about some weird paperwork, and now I was looking at the possibility of a major legal battle that could destroy what was left of my relationship with my father and completely upend the family business. But Margaret also explained something that changed my perspective on the whole situation. She said that trust disputes like this rarely end up in court if both parties are reasonable. Most of the time, families find a way to work out an arrangement that honors the original intent while allowing everyone to save face. The threat of legal action is usually enough to bring people to the negotiating table. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I told Margaret to prepare a formal notice letter to my father, explaining my position as a trust beneficiary and requesting a meeting to discuss transitioning control of the company according to Grandpa's wishes. Nothing threatening or hostile, just a clear, professional communication that would put all the cards on the table. Looking back now, I realized it was a moment when this whole thing stopped being about family drama and started being about business. I wasn't just a hurt son who'd been kicked out of the house anymore. I was a legal party with legitimate rights and interests that needed to be protected. And for the first time since this mess started, I felt like I had some actual power in the situation. Margaret spent the next week crafting what she called a formal notice letter, basically a professional way of saying, hey, we need to talk about this trust situation, and ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. The letter laid out the basic facts, referenced the relevant legal documents, and requested a meeting within 30 days to discuss how to move forward in accordance with Grandpa's wishes. I have to admit, reading that letter before it went out gave me a weird mix of emotions. On one hand, it felt incredibly validating to see my position stated so clearly and professionally. Here was an experienced lawyer essentially confirming that I wasn't crazy, that my grandfather really had intended for me to inherit the business, and that Dad's behavior over the past few years had been legally questionable at best. On the other hand, I knew that sending this letter would basically be declaring war on my own family. There would be no going back to pretending everything was fine, no more hoping that Dad would eventually cool down, and we could work things out over a beer and a football game. This was me officially saying that I was willing to fight for what I believed was rightfully mine. The letter was sent via certified mail on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, I still hadn't heard anything from Dad, which honestly wasn't surprising. Dad's usual approach to problems was to ignore them and hope they'd go away on their own. But I had heard from Jake, who called me sounding confused and a little panicked. Apparently, Dad had shown the letter and was absolutely losing his mind. According to Jake, Dad was convinced that I was trying to steal the family business with fake documents and frivolous lawsuits. He'd apparently spent the better part of 2 days ranting about ungrateful children and scheming lawyers, and had even talked about changing the locks on the office building to keep me out. Jake tried to play mediator, suggesting that maybe we could all sit down together and work out some kind of compromise. But when I explained the details of what I'd found in Grandpa's documents, even Jake had to admit that the situation was more complicated than he'd initially thought. He promised to try to talk sense into Dad, but I could tell he was caught in the middle of something way bigger than he wanted to deal with. The 30-day deadline came and went with no response from Dad. Margaret had warned me that this might happen, and she'd already prepared the next step in the process. She filed a formal petition with the county court, essentially asking a judge to review the trust documents and enforce the terms that Dad was apparently ignoring. Now, I want to be clear about something here, because I know how this might sound to some of you. I didn't want to take my father to court. I didn't wake up one morning and decide it would be fun to destroy my family relationships with expensive legal battles. But at some point, you have to stand up for yourself, especially when someone is trying to gaslight you into believing you don't deserve what was clearly intended for you. The court filing made everything real in a way that the letters and phone calls hadn't. Within a week, Dad had hired his own lawyer, some guy who specialized in business disputes and apparently had a reputation for being pretty aggressive in litigation. Suddenly, we weren't just having a family argument anymore. We were officially adversaries in the legal system. Dad's lawyer immediately filed a motion challenging the validity of the trust, claiming that Grandpa had been suffering from dementia when he'd signed the documents, and that the whole arrangement was therefore invalid. They also alleged that I was trying to manipulate the situation with forged documents, and that Margaret was encouraging frivolous litigation for her own financial benefit. Reading those court filings was like getting punched in the stomach. It was one thing for Dad to be angry with me in private, but seeing his lawyer essentially call me a fraud and a thief in official legal documents was devastating. They were attacking not just my claim to the business, but my character and integrity as a person. But Margaret had anticipated this strategy, and she was ready with a comprehensive response. She'd spent weeks gathering evidence to support our position, including medical records showing that Grandpa had been mentally sharp right up until his final illness, testimony from the original lawyer who'd helped draft the trust documents, and financial records showing how Dad had been managing the company since taking control. The medical records were particularly damaging to Dad's case. Grandpa had been seeing his regular doctor every few months during 2009, and all of his cognitive assessments showed normal mental function. There was absolutely no evidence of dementia, confusion, or any other condition that would have impaired his ability to make sound legal decisions. Even more importantly, Margaret had tracked down the original estate planning lawyer who'd worked with Grandpa to set up the trust. This guy was now retired, but he still had detailed notes from their meetings, and he was willing to testify that Grandpa had been very clear about his intentions and had specifically discussed his concerns about Dad's management approach. The financial analysis was probably the most eye-opening part of Margaret's research. She'd hired a forensic accountant to review the company's books since Dad had taken over, and the results were pretty shocking. Over the past few years, Dad had been paying himself nearly 3 times what comparable business owners in the area typically earned, and he'd been classifying personal expenses as business costs in ways that were questionable at best. But here's the thing that really convinced me we were on the right track. The accountant analysis showed that despite Dad's generous compensation packages, the overall business performance had been declining. Revenue was flat, profit margins were shrinking, and several long-term customer relationships had been damaged by cost-cutting measures that had compromised quality. In other words, Grandpa's concerns about Dad's management style hadn't just been theoretical. The evidence suggested that Dad really was prioritizing short-term personal benefits over the long-term health of the business, exactly like Grandpa had worried about in his letters. The court case moved pretty quickly once both sides had filed their initial paperwork. We had a preliminary hearing in early February, where the judge reviewed the basic facts and scheduled a more comprehensive hearing for the following month. At that preliminary hearing, it became pretty clear that the judge wasn't buying Dad's claims about Grandpa's mental capacity or document forgery. Judge Harrison was probably in his 60s, with a kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of family business disputes over the years. After reviewing the medical records and hearing testimony from the original estate planning lawyer, he made some comments that pretty much telegraphed how he was leaning. He noted that the trust documents appeared to be professionally prepared and properly executed, that there was no credible evidence of mental incapacity, and that the pattern of financial management since Grandpa's death raised legitimate questions about fiduciary duty. He also suggested that both parties might want to consider settlement negotiations before proceeding to a full trial. That's when things got interesting. Dad's lawyer requested a recess to discuss options with his client, and when they came back, they indicated they might be open to settlement discussions. Translation: they realized they were probably going to lose if this went to trial, and they wanted to cut their losses before things got even more expensive and embarrassing. The settlement negotiations took about 6 weeks, with both lawyers going back and forth on various proposals and counteroffers. Dad's initial position was that he'd be willing to give me some kind of minority partnership stake in exchange for dropping all legal claims. My position was that the trust clearly indicated I should have controlling interest, and that's what I intended to pursue. Eventually, we reached an agreement that gave me exactly what Grandpa had intended, controlling ownership of the company, with Dad retaining a minority stake and staying on as a paid consultant for a transitional period. Dad also agreed to repay about $60,000 in excessive compensation he'd taken over the previous 3 years, though he structured it as a reduction in his future consulting fees rather than a lump sum payment. The day we signed the settlement agreement was probably one of the strangest days of my life. Here I was, 23 years old, suddenly the majority owner of a multi-million-dollar business, sitting across a conference table from my father, who could barely look me in the eye. We'd gone from family dinner conversations to legal adversaries to business partners, all in a span of about 6 months. But you know what? Despite all the drama and legal battles, I felt like I'd finally done right by my grandfather's memory. He'd trusted me with something important, and I'd fought to honor that trust even when it meant standing up to my own father. And now I had the chance to prove that his faith in me hadn't been misplaced. The first few months of actually running the business were absolutely terrifying. I mean, I had a business degree and I'd grown up around the industry, but there's nothing like being responsible for payroll and major decisions. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd bitten off way more than I could chew, but I was determined to prove that Grandpa's faith in me hadn't been misplaced. What I found was both encouraging and concerning. We still had solid customer relationships and loyal employees, but there were definitely problems that needed attention: quality control issues, delivery delays, and low employee morale from Dad's micromanaging style. I focused on three main areas: rebuilding customer relationships, improving operational efficiency, and creating a better workplace culture. Nothing revolutionary, just getting back to the basics that had made the company successful in the first place. I personally visited every major client during my first 2 months, listening to their concerns and working out solutions. One longtime customer, Mike Rodriguez, was brutally honest about the problems they'd been having with Dad's increasingly difficult management style. But he also told me that my grandfather had been one of the most straight-shooting businessmen he'd ever worked with, and he was hoping I'd inherited those same values. The operational improvements took time, but made a huge difference. We invested in new inventory management software, reorganized the warehouse, and established better communication protocols. I also focused on supplier relationships that prioritize consistent quality over just the lowest prices. The workplace culture changes were probably the most personally satisfying. Monthly team meetings, profit-sharing programs, and actually recognizing good work publicly. Within 6 months, you could feel the difference. People seemed more engaged and proud of their work. The financial results spoke for themselves. By the end of my first year, we'd increased revenue by 25%, improved profit margin significantly, and built up healthy cash reserves. More importantly, customer satisfaction was higher than it had been in years. What happened with my relationship with Dad? Well, it's complicated. The consulting arrangement lasted about 8 months before it became clear it wasn't working. Dad struggled with not being the final decision maker, and I found it difficult to implement changes when I constantly had to justify everything to someone who disagreed with my approach. Eventually, we had a frank conversation, and Dad agreed it would be better if he stepped back completely. We restructured his agreement into a gradual buyout of his remaining stake, giving him financial security while allowing me complete operational control. For about 18 months after that, we had virtually no contact. Dad moved to Florida, probably to put some distance between us. Jake would update me occasionally, but the topic of the business was off limits in family conversations. Then, almost exactly 2 years after I'd taken over, something unexpected happened. I was working late one evening, reviewing proposals for a major municipal contract, when someone knocked on the office door. When I opened it, there was my father. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. Gone was the confident, intimidating presence that had dominated my childhood. This was just a man in his 60s, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and looking uncomfortable. He asked if we could talk. Said he'd been thinking a lot about everything that had happened, about the things he'd said and done. He admitted that he'd been wrong about a lot of stuff, that he let his pride and fear cloud his judgment. He'd been watching the company's progress from a distance, and he was impressed with what I'd accomplished. Then came the question I'd been both expecting and dreading. He asked if there might be a place for him in the business again, not as an owner or decision-maker, but maybe as consultant or advisor. He said he missed being part of something meaningful, and that he thought his experience might still have value. I sat there looking at this man who had once called me an accidental mistake and kicked me out of his house, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just emptiness. 2 years of building something from the ground up, of proving myself, of creating my own success, and now he wanted back in? I told him I appreciated him coming to talk to me, and that I was glad he could acknowledge his mistakes. But I also told him that I'd built something good here, something that worked, and I wasn't interested in complicating that by bringing old dynamics back into the picture. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Asked if maybe we could at least try to rebuild some kind of personal relationship, even if business was off the table. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure there was enough foundation left to build on. After he left that night, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about everything that had led to that moment. The scared kid who'd found his name in some SEC documents. The young man who'd been kicked out of his own home. The business owner who'd fought for what was rightfully his. Here's what I realized. I didn't take the business away from my father. I didn't steal it or manipulate the system, or get lucky with some legal technicality. I simply claimed what my grandfather had deliberately and carefully arranged for me to inherit. Dad had spent years treating the company as his personal property, ignoring the legal framework that was supposed to protect it for future generations.